The tray was already in Hanna Brandt's hands when she stopped walking. She had taken 6 steps from the serving line. She counted them later, in the dark, though she didn't know why, and then her feet simply refused to continue. In front of her, the long wooden bench stretched toward the far wall of the mess hall. Behind her, another woman was waiting with another tray. Around her, the low sound of 100 women trying not to make noise moved through the room like a careful current. But Hanna had stopped because her hands had stopped, and her hands had stopped because of what was on the tray. 2 thick slices of bacon, cut unevenly, still dark at the edges where the fat had gone crisp. 3 eggs scrambled soft, the yellow so bright it almost looked painted. A stack of pancakes, 4 of them, maybe 5, with a square of butter melting down the top that was larger than anything she had seen on a plate in 2 years. A piece of bread, folded open, the inside white and steaming. A small glass of what looked like real milk, and beside all of it, set on the metal corner of the tray, as if it were nothing at all, was an orange. Not half an orange, not a slice of orange, a whole orange, round and heavy and perfect, the skin still cold from wherever it had come from. Hanna stared at it. Behind her, the woman waiting, Marta. She knew without turning, because Marta's breathing was always louder than it should have been, made a small, impatient sound. Not unkind, just tired. Marta had been in front of Hanna in line on the ships, and behind her in the processing halls. And Hanna recognized the rhythm of Marta's body, the way you recognize the footsteps of someone you've been locked in a house with. But this hall was new. The transport had ended yesterday afternoon. This was their first American morning. Move. Marta whispered in German, very low. Move, or they'll think something is wrong. Hanna moved. She walked the remaining distance to the bench. Her legs knew where to go, even though she was no longer thinking about them. She set the tray down in front of her and sat, and for a moment she did not lift her eyes from the wood of the table. Across from her, Greta was already seated. Greta was the oldest of them, somewhere in her 50s, though it was impossible to tell, because her hair had gone white in the transport and her face had gone quiet years before that. She had her hands folded in her lap. Her tray was in front of her. She was not eating. She was looking at the food the way a person looks at a dog. They are not sure will bite. To Greta's right, Liesel was holding her spoon. Liesel was 19. She had been 17 when she had been issued her uniform. She was the youngest woman in the camp, and the one most likely to flinch when a door slammed. She was holding the spoon, but she had not put into anything yet. The spoon was simply in her hand, at the height of the table, perfectly still. Marta sat down beside Hanna. Her tray landed on the wood with a small flat sound. She did not look at her food. She looked around the room. That was Marta's way. She did not eat until she had counted the exits, counted the guards, and counted the other women. Hanna had seen her do it in 3 different halls now, in 3 different towns, in 2 different countries. It took Marta exactly 4 seconds. The young American soldier who had spoken to them at the door, the one with the light brown hair and the uniform that did not quite fit at the shoulders, walked past their bench with a metal coffee pot in one hand. He said nothing to them. He did not look at them. He was not ignoring them. He simply had a job, and his job was to carry the coffee pot to the far wall, where an older man in a white apron was standing beside the kitchen door. The older man took the coffee pot. He said something to the soldier. The soldier nodded and walked away. The older man set the coffee pot down on a steel counter and wiped his hands on the front of his apron. Then he turned and looked at Hanna's table. Hanna did not know why he looked. She did not know if he looked at her specifically, or at Greta, or at all of them at once. But for a full second, she counted it later too. He stood very still and watched the 4 of them sitting at their tray with none of their forks in motion. And then he did something she would not understand until much later. He nodded once very slightly, and he turned back to his counter. That was the moment Hanna realized she was not going to eat. Not yet, not this morning. She could feel the warmth of the food in front of her coming up through the air. She could smell the butter on the pancakes. The orange on the corner of the tray was so bright it hurt her eyes. Her mouth was full of water. Her stomach had become something sharp and demanding. She was 26 years old, and she was hungry in a way that had stopped being ordinary hunger months ago and had become something closer to a shape she carried around inside her body. Everything she wanted was on the tray, and she could not lift her hand. Greta, across from her, was whispering something. Hanna had to lean forward to hear. "Is this even allowed?" That was the sentence. That was the whole sentence. Greta said it once, very quietly in German, with her eyes on her own plate. She was not asking for an answer. She was speaking to food itself. Marta heard it. Hanna heard it. Liesel heard it. And her spoon, still suspended, still perfectly still at the height of the table, began to tremble very slightly. A young woman at the next bench, one of the older auxiliaries who had come in on the second transport, turned her head at the sound of Greta's voice. Her tray was identical. Her expression was identical. She looked at Greta for a long moment, and then, without speaking, she lowered her eyes to her own food, and the smallest movement of her throat told Hanna that she was trying not to cry. The soldier with the brown hair came back through the hall. He was carrying something else now, a wooden crate with smaller trays stacked inside. He passed their table again. This time he glanced at them, not at Hanna, at the trays. He registered that none of them had begun eating. His face did not change. He kept walking. Her name was Hanna Brandt. She was 26 years old. She had been a medical auxiliary, once, in what felt like another country and another life. And right now, in this room, she was about to understand something that would take her the rest of her life to describe. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I want to know who's in this room tonight. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. These are the stories that live only here. Greta still hadn't picked up her fork. It took her another full minute. Hanna watched the minute happen. She watched Greta's hands unfold slowly in her lap. She watched Greta's right hand move toward the edge of the tray. She watched Greta's fingers hover, just hover, over the piece of bread on the side of the plate. Not the pancakes, not the eggs, not the bacon, because bacon in that quantity was not something any of them could comprehend as belonging to them. Bread was the only thing on the tray that existed in the world Greta recognized. Bread was safe. Bread had rules. Greta picked up the bread. She brought it to her face. She did not eat it. She smelled it. Her eyes closed. A long exhale moved through her body, and Hanna saw her shoulders drop by an inch. The way you drop your shoulders when you set down something you've been carrying for a long time. Then she tore a small piece off the edge. Not a bite, a piece, the size of a fingernail, and she put it in her mouth. She chewed once. She chewed again. She opened her eyes. She looked at Hanna and across the table. In a whisper so quiet that Hanna had to read it on her lips, she said, "It's real." That was what broke the table. Marta exhaled through her nose, a sound she made when she made a decision, and picked up her fork. She did not go for the bacon, either. She went for the eggs. Small scoop, half a spoonful, raised it to her mouth, chewed, swallowed, stared straight ahead at the wall behind Hanna, as if she needed the wall to remain exactly where it was in order for the eggs to be eaten. Liesel's spoon finally moved. She lowered it into the eggs. She lifted it to her mouth. Her hand was shaking so badly that half of it fell back onto the plate. She did not seem to notice. She took what had survived, put it between her lips, closed her mouth, and began to cry without making any sound. Hanna watched them eat. She could not make herself begin. Her own fork was lying on the tray. Her own hand was lying on the table beside it. There was nothing physically preventing her from lifting the fork, and yet the distance between her hand and the fork was enormous. It was the distance between the woman she had been told she was, the woman she had been told German women were, and the woman who would reach toward a plate like this one as if she deserved it. She had been told in many different voices, over the course of several years, what happened to German women who fell into American hands. None of those voices had described this. None of those voices had described a stack of pancakes. None of them had described an orange. None of them had described an older man in an apron who nodded once at a silent table and then turned back to his counter with the quiet of a man who had been expecting the silence and was prepared to wait it out. Hanna reached for the bread. She did what Greta had done. She brought it to her face. She smelled it. Wheat. Real wheat. The kind of wheat that had not been cut with sawdust or oats or anything else to stretch a ration further than it was meant to go. Warm, yeasted, soft enough that her thumb left a small dent in the crust when she pressed, and the crust pushed back up a moment later, because the bread was that fresh. She did not cry. Crying was not what her body did. Her body did something quieter. Her hand, holding the bread, began to shake, and she pressed the bread against her forehead for a moment. She would have no memory of doing this later, and no one at the table would mention it. And then she took a bite. The hall around her continued to make its small, careful noises. Trays sliding, forks against metal. A cough. The quiet German of two women whispering at a bench 3 rows over. Somewhere near the kitchen, the older man in the apron was pouring coffee into a line of tin cups, one after another, with the rhythm of someone who had done it 1,000 times. Hanna did not know how long she sat with the bread in her mouth before she chewed it. When she finally did, she understood something she had no language for yet. The bread was not a meal. The bread was a sentence. A sentence written by someone she had never met, in a kitchen she had never seen, in a country she had been told would be the end of her. And the sentence read, "You're going to be fed." She swallowed. She reached for the fork. Marta, beside her, had begun on the bacon. Marta did not look at her bacon while she ate it. Marta looked at Sergeant Brennan, who was standing at the door of the hall with his arms folded and his expression unreadable, and she chewed slowly and steadily with her eyes on him the entire time, because Marta was not the kind of woman who lowered her gaze while she was eating something she did not yet trust. Liesel had finished the eggs. She had moved on to the pancakes. She was cutting them into small squares with her knife and eating them one square at a time, and with every bite her crying got a little quieter, until by the 4th square she was not crying anymore. She was just eating with the concentration of a child who had been told, for the first time in a very long time, that a thing was for her. Across the table, Greta had begun to laugh. It was not a large laugh. It was a small sound, almost embarrassed, and she covered her mouth with one hand as if to apologize for it. But her shoulders were shaking, and when Hanna looked at her, she saw that Greta's eyes were wet and her mouth was smiling, and she was laughing quietly at nothing in particular, at the ridiculousness of the plate, at the ridiculousness of having been afraid of it, at the ridiculousness of the world, which had, for reasons she could not understand, put a stack of pancakes in front of her and asked her, please, to eat. "I thought they were going to starve us," Greta whispered in between her quiet laughs. I told myself all week, Greta, be ready, you will be hungry, you will be—" She shook her head. She could not finish the sentence. She picked up her own piece of bread and took another small tear from the edge. Hanna ate half the eggs before she allowed herself to look again at the orange. If this is the kind of morning that has a place in your own memory, a morning where something small and kind showed up in front of you when you were not prepared for it, I want to hear about it. Leave it in the comments, in one sentence if that's all you have. I read everyone. And if you found this channel this morning and you've gotten this far, subscribe before you leave. Everything on this channel is someone's bread. She did not pick the orange up. She was not ready. But she looked at it, and she knew already that it was going to be the last thing she ate, and she knew, without being able to say why, that she was going to peel it herself with her own fingers slowly, and she was going to put the peel on the side of the tray the way her mother had always put orange peel on the side of a plate, the way her grandmother had put orange peel on the side of a plate, the way the women of her family had always done it, in the kitchen in Bremen, before the war had come and taken the kitchen with it. Her mother had cooked with oranges at Christmas. She had sliced them into rounds and put them on a plate with cloves stuck into the peel, and the whole apartment had smelled like oranges for a day. Hanna had not seen an orange in 4 years. She did not pick up the orange. She went back to the eggs. Beside her, Marta had slowed down. She was on her 3rd piece of bacon, and she had stopped watching Sergeant Brennan, and she was chewing each bite more slowly than the last one, the way a person eats when they have realized that the meal is not going to be taken away from them, and there is no longer any reason to eat quickly. "I don't understand," Marta said quietly to her plate. None of them answered, because none of them understood either. The older man in the apron. Hanna would learn his name later that day, from Private Ellis, who said it with the respect of someone who was a little bit afraid of him. "Mr. Harmon, he's been here since before any of you got assigned. The older man in the apron was walking a line of benches now, with a second metal coffee pot in one hand and a small stack of tin cups balanced in the crook of his other arm. He was moving slowly, because his right leg did not bend all the way, and every third step was slightly shorter than the one before it. His eyes were not on the prisoners. His eyes were on the floor, just in front of his boots, because the floor was uneven and he did not want to trip. He reached Hanna's table. He set down the tin cups, 1, 2, 3, 4, one in front of each of them. He did not look at any of them while he did it. He poured coffee into the first cup, then the second, then the third, then the fourth. The steam came up out of each cup slowly, and the smell of the coffee, dark, bitter, clean, was so strong and so specific that Hanna heard Greta across the table make a small sound, the same small sound a person makes in their sleep when they are dreaming of something they have lost. Mr. Harmon finished pouring. He set the pot down on the edge of the table, and finally, for the first time, he looked at them. He had brown eyes. That was the first thing Hanna noticed. Not blue, not gray, a soft, plain brown. His face was a kind of face that had once been handsome, years ago, before it had gotten tired. He had lines at the corners of his eyes, and the lines were not from smiling. They were from squinting into heat, the kind of heat that came from an oven or stove. His apron had a stain on the left side that had been washed too many times to come all the way out. He did not smile at them. He did not speak to them. He simply stood at the end of their table for a moment with both hands on the edge of it, and he looked at the four of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, with a face that Hanna could not read, and then he picked up the coffee pot and moved to the next bench. Liesel reached for her cup. She held it with both hands. She did not drink from it. She just held it. The hall was warm now. Hanna had not noticed, when she had first come in, that the hall was warm. She had been too concerned with all the other things. The soldiers, the smell, the tray, the orange. But now she could feel the heat coming up from the floor, from the long iron stove on the far wall, from the ovens in the kitchen behind Mr. Harmon, from the 100 breathing bodies, sitting along the benches in their rough gray uniforms. The hall was warm. It was the first warm place Hanna had been inside of since October. I want to stop here for a second, because something important is happening, and I don't want it to slip past you. These women were not expecting this. These women had been prepared. By their training, by their officers, by their newspapers, by their radio broadcasts, by every voice they had heard for several years, to expect something very specific when they were captured. They had been prepared for starvation, for cold, for humiliation, for rooms without warmth and plates without food, and guards who would stare through them as if they were not there. They were prepared for all of that. They were ready. They were not prepared for pancakes. They were not prepared for a piece of bread that smelled like their mother's kitchen. They were not prepared for a man in an apron to put a cup of coffee in front of them without being asked. They were not prepared for an orange. If you're feeling right now what I think you're feeling, that small, tight thing in your chest, the one you get when you see someone be kind to someone who is expecting cruelty, I need you to do one thing. Subscribe. Right now, while you're still in the room with them. These stories only exist on this channel because people like you keep coming back. Don't be someone who left. Hanna finally picked up her cup. She drank. The coffee was strong. Stronger than any coffee she had ever tasted in her life. It was bitter in a way that was almost painful at first. She winced. She felt her face twist. And then, a second later, a deeper warmth opened up inside the bitterness, and underneath the warmth there was something she recognized. Something old. Something from before. The smell of her father's coat when he came in from the street in December. The sound of her mother setting a saucer on a wooden table. The way her grandfather had sat at the head of the table on Sunday mornings with a cup between his hands. Not speaking, just being present. The way old men are present when they have nothing else to give you. Her father had been a carpenter. Her mother had made coffee every morning, even during the years when the coffee was no longer really coffee. Her grandfather had died in 1938, before any of this had started, and Hanna had envied him for years afterward, without understanding why. She drank more of the coffee. Slowly, the heat of it moved down her chest. Beside her, Marta was making a face. Marta had never liked strong coffee. Marta was drinking it anyway. Marta was drinking it because she had spent 4 years not being given the choice. And now that she was being given the choice, she was going to take every cup of coffee she could get her hands on, regardless of how it tasted, because the choice itself was the point. Mr. Harmon had reached the far end of the hall. He set the second coffee pot down on the counter, beside the first one. He stood for a moment with both hands on the edge of the counter, looking at nothing. The way a man stands with his leg is hurting him, and he needs 1 second to let the pain pass. Then he turned around and walked back into the kitchen. Private Ellis appeared at their table. He had a small wooden tray in his hand, with something on it that Hanna could not immediately identify. He set the tray down in the center of their bench. It was butter, a small white dish of butter, separate from the butter already on the pancakes. Extra butter, more than any of them would have been given in a single month at home. Ellis did not say anything. He gave them a small, almost apologetic nod, as if he were embarrassed somehow on behalf of the butter for being so much of it, and he turned and walked back toward the kitchen door. Marta looked at the butter. Then she looked at Hanna. "What is happening?" she said, in German. Hanna did not answer. She did not know. The hall had begun to fill with the low sound of forks and voices, because the other women had started to eat in earnest now. And as they ate, they were beginning hesitantly to speak. Not loudly. None of them were speaking loudly. But a murmur was moving through the room, a murmur in German and in occasional broken English. And the murmur was the sound of 100 women beginning, cautiously, to believe something they had been told was not possible. Greta had picked up her fork now. She was eating the eggs. She was eating them slowly, one small portion at a time, and between bites she was saying, under her breath, in a voice too soft to hear clearly, what sounded like a prayer, or possibly a list of names. Liesel had finished her pancakes. She was working on the bread now. She had spread butter on it, from the small dish Ellis had brought, and she was eating it in tiny, careful bites, the way a child eats a piece of cake at a birthday party, when she is afraid someone will notice how much she wants it. Hanna ate her eggs. She ate her bacon. She ate half of the pancakes before she had to stop, because her stomach, which had shrunk over the last year to the size of a fist, could not accept any more. She drank the milk. The milk was cold and sweet and rich, and it tasted so clean that for a moment she wondered whether it was milk at all, or something else pretending to be milk, something that did not have a name in any language she knew. She did not touch the orange. The orange was still there, on the corner of the tray, round and heavy and perfect. She was saving it. Sergeant Brennan stepped forward from the door. Hanna felt the shift in the room before she heard him. Marta felt it first. Marta's back went straight. Her fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Her eyes came up from her plate and locked on the sergeant. And in that motion, Hanna remembered very clearly, for the first time since she had sat down, exactly where she was. She was a prisoner. She was a prisoner sitting in a warm room in a country that was still at war with her own, and the man at the door of the room was a man who had the authority to decide what happened next, and the plate of food in front of her was not a gift and was not a promise, and was not a sign that the world had become kind. The plate was policy. The plate was bureaucracy. The plate was a system that could be changed at any moment by any man with enough rank to decide to change it. Brennan raised his voice. He did not shout. He spoke loudly, in the way of someone who needed to be heard at the far end of a long room. His English was fast. Hanna caught only a few words. Finished. Line up. 0730. The translator, a thin older woman who had come on the first transport and spoke English like someone who had learned it in a schoolroom 40 years ago, stood up from her bench near the front and repeated the sergeant's words in German, clearly and without emphasis. Those of you who are finished, please line up at the door. Everyone must be out of the hall by 7:30. The hall needs to be cleaned. That was all. That was the entire instruction. There was nothing cruel in it. There was nothing in it that was not fair. Sergeant Brennan was simply doing what sergeants did, keeping a schedule, moving a building, making sure the next thing happened when it was supposed to happen. But his voice had done something to the room. The murmur had stopped. The forks had slowed. Greta's small prayer had gone silent. Liesel had frozen with a piece of buttered bread halfway to her mouth. Marta let out a long, slow breath through her nose. "There it is," she said under her breath in German. "There is where we are." Hanna picked up her tray. She stood up, Her legs were shaky, but they held her. She looked once at her plate. The bacon was gone. The eggs were gone. Most of the pancakes were gone. The orange was still there. She picked up the orange and put it in the pocket of her uniform. Greta saw her do it. Greta gave her a small look, a look that was not quite a smile, because Greta did not smile anymore, but a look that had the shape of a smile, the way a face has the shape of a room it used to live in. Then Greta picked up her own orange and put it in her own pocket. And without saying anything, Liesel did the same. And Marta last did the same. For oranges, for pockets, for women walking to the door. We're going to stay with Hanna for a long time this morning. What you've seen so far is the smallest part of what is about to happen to her. Everything she thought was true about the Americans, about the war, about herself, is going to be taken apart in this camp in small pieces over the course of weeks. Subscribe now, because what's coming next is the moment where she starts to understand why this happened. And that moment is the hardest one. Don't miss it. They walked in a line to the door of the hall, tray by tray, and placed their trays on the wooden rack at the wall. Sergeant Brennan did not look at them as they passed. He was looking at his watch. He was a man who looked at his watch several times a minute, the way other men touched their rifles. Private Ellis was standing near the door. He held the door open for them, the way a boy holds a door open for someone who has taught him how to hold a door open. Hanna walked past him. He did not meet her eyes. He was looking at a spot on the floor, slightly to her left. She stepped out into the morning. The air was cold. There had been frost overnight, and the ground was hard under her boots. The sky was the color of milk. She could see the other buildings of the camp from the door of the mess hall, the barracks, with their long rows of thin wooden walls, the watchtowers, the low building where the medical tent stood. Smoke was coming from the chimney of the mess hall. Smoke was coming from the chimney of the barracks. The whole camp smelled like with smoke and wet earth and something else, something she did not immediately recognize, something that turned out, when she walked closer to it, to be the smell of laundry on a line. She had not seen laundry on a line in 4 years. Behind her, Marta fell into step beside her. Marta's pocket, like Hanna's, had a small round bulge in it. The bulge was the orange. He watched us. Marta said quietly in German, "Who?" "The man, the cook, the one with the leg." Hanna turned her head slightly, but she did not look back at the mess hall. He watched everyone. "No." Marta's voice was low. "He watched us." They walked back to the barracks without speaking. The frost crunched under their boots. Somewhere beyond the fence, a truck engine started and then settled into a low idle, a flock of birds. Starlings, maybe. Hanna did not know American birds yet. Lifted off from the roof of the next building and scattered into the milk-white sky. In the barracks, they took the oranges out of their pockets and held them in their hands, and none of them ate them. That afternoon, at the scheduled hour for cleaning the barracks, Hanna rolled up her sleeves and began to sweep the floor of her row of bunks. The broom was old. The floor was uneven. She had been assigned to this task on the first day, and she had done it every day since, because small repetitive work was what held her together. While she was sweeping, she realized she had been humming. It was a song from home, a children's song. Her mother had sung it to her brother when he was little, and to her when she was little, and later, during the bad years, her mother had sung it to herself in the kitchen, very quietly, with her back to the door, when she thought no one was listening. Hanna had not heard the song in her own head in nearly 2 years. She had not remembered it in nearly 2 years. And yet, standing with a broom in her hands in a barracks in a country at war with her own, she was humming it. She stopped. She stood very still. She waited for the humming to start again, to prove that she had not imagined it. It did not start, but the shape of it was there, in the back of her throat, in the muscles of her face. She had been humming. Her body had been humming without her. She went back to sweeping. That night, after lights out, she lay on her bunk with the orange on her chest. She had not eaten it. She had not peeled it. She was holding it with both hands, and she was feeling the weight of it against her ribs, the slight coolness of its skin, the small faint sweetness it gave off even through its peel. In the bunk above her, Greta was praying. Hanna could hear the shape of it, even though she could not hear the words. Greta prayed every night. She had always prayed since before the war, and she had kept praying during the war, and she was still praying now, in a wooden building in a country where she had never expected to see another morning. Hanna had sometimes found Greta's prayers irritating in the early days of the transport. Tonight, she did not find them irritating. Tonight, they sounded like the song her mother used to sing. In the bunk 2 rows over, Liesel was crying. She was crying the quiet kind of crying, the kind that was trying not to be heard, the kind you learn in the barracks where crying loudly was a thing that got you noticed. Hanna listened to Liesel cry, and she did not get up because there was nothing to say. Hanna understood the crying. Hanna had cried that way herself 2 weeks ago on the transport, when they had finally been given water from a proper canteen and not a bucket. The kindness had not been the crying's cause. The kindness had been what finally let the crying happen. In the bunk across the aisle, Marta was not sleeping. Hanna could tell Marta was not sleeping by the way Marta was not moving. Marta had a particular stillness when she was pretending to sleep, and a different stillness when she was really sleeping, and Hanna had learned the difference. Marta was not sleeping tonight. Marta was lying on her back with her eyes open, thinking. Marta did a lot of her thinking at night. She did not share what she thought about. Hanna turned the orange over in her hands. She finally understood, lying there in the dark, that the reason she had not eaten it was not that she was saving it. She had told herself in the hall that she was saving it, but now, in the dark, with the weight on her chest, she understood that she had not eaten it because she was afraid that if she ate it and the taste of it was exactly what she remembered, she would not be able to bear it. She wanted to want the orange. She was not sure, yet, whether she was allowed to want anything at all. She fell asleep with the orange still in her hand. The next morning, there were pancakes again. The morning after that, there were pancakes again. The morning after that, there were biscuits with something called sausage gravy, a thick pale sauce that Hanna had never seen before, and eggs and bacon and coffee, and a small piece of yellow cheese on the side, and another orange. The orange had become a ritual. Every morning, one orange on every tray. Hanna did not eat hers. She carried it back to the barracks in her pocket. She placed it on the shelf above her bunk. By the end of the first week, there were 7 oranges on her shelf, and she had eaten none of them, and she could not have explained to anyone who asked why. Greta had eaten hers. Greta ate her orange every day, slowly, in her bunk, after lights out. Liesel had started eating hers on the 2nd day. Marta had eaten her first one in 2 bites, in the barracks, standing up, the way a person eats the food of an enemy before the enemy changes their mind. But Hanna had not eaten any of them. One afternoon, in the 2nd week, Mr. Harmon came through the yard behind the mess hall while Hanna was walking back from the laundry. He was carrying a crate of empty milk bottles. He was limping more that day than usual. Hanna stepped aside on the path to let him pass. He stopped. He set the crate down. He wiped his forehead with his wrist. He looked at her. His brown eyes were the same as they had been that first morning, tired, plain, unreadable. "Morgan," he said very quietly. Hanna did not understand. He repeated it, slowly, "Morgan." She understood. Then he was saying her name, or a version of it. He had heard it from Ellis, probably, or from a translator. He was saying Hanna Brandt, and his mouth was not shaped for the sounds, and it was coming out as Morgan, and he was trying. "Hanna," she said. "Hanna." He nodded. "Hanna." They stood there for a moment on the path. He picked up the crate again. Before he walked away, he said one more thing. His voice was low. The path was empty, and no one else was listening, and he said it as if he were speaking to a memory rather than to her. "You eat the orange," he said. It was not a question. It was not quite an instruction. It was somewhere in between. "You eat the orange, understand?" He did not wait for her answer. He picked up his crate, and he walked back toward the kitchen, limping on his right leg. And the door of the kitchen closed behind him, and Hanna stood on the path for a long time afterward, holding her broom. That evening, she ate the orange. She peeled it sitting on her bunk, with the peel on a cloth she laid across her knees, and the peel came off in one long unbroken spiral, because her mother had taught her, when she was very small, how to peel an orange without breaking the spiral. The smell of the orange filled the barracks. Greta, 3 bunks down, looked up from her sewing and did not say anything. Liesel, across the aisle, smiled. Hanna ate the orange one segment at a time. The first segment tasted the way she had remembered. The second tasted better than she had remembered. By the third, she was crying very quietly, and she did not wipe her face because she did not want to take her hands off the orange. She ate the whole thing. She saved the peel. She put the peel in a small tin cup she had found in the laundry, and she kept the tin cup on the shelf above her bunk, where the 6 other oranges, now reduced to 1, still sat in their row, watching her. If you've gotten this far in the story, I want to ask you to do one thing, one small thing, before we continue. Pause. Look at the comment section. Tell me in a single sentence what you would have done in that hall on that first morning if the tray had been set in front of you. I read every one of them. I know these stories are long. I know your time matters. The fact that you are still here tells me something about you, and the people who stay, who comment, who return. Those are the people this channel exists for. Subscribe if you have not. This is the halfway mark. The second half is what we've been walking toward. In the third week, the rumors started. The rumors were not unusual. Every camp had rumors. Rumors about transfers, rumors about releases, rumors about the war. This one came into the new transport that arrived on a Tuesday morning. 22 women, most of them thinner than anyone already in the camp. Most of them quieter than anyone already in the camp. All of them looking at the mess hallway Hanna had looked at it 3 weeks earlier. They came with news. News from home. News that reached them to the long, cold chain of whispered words and folded letters and slow transfers. And by the time it reached Hanna's barracks, the news had been traveling for nearly 2 months, and it was no longer news. It was history. Bremen had been bombed. Hanna heard it from a woman named Ursula, who had been in a camp further west before being moved here. Ursula had been in Hamburg before that, and Hamburg before Hamburg, and she was the kind of woman who seemed to collect information the way other women collected thread. She said it casually at the end of the line for supper, without knowing that Hanna was from Bremen. The factories are gone. The old district is gone. The area by the river. Much of it, anyway. Hanna did not eat supper that night. Marta noticed. Marta did not say anything at first. Marta did not ask. Marta simply sat down beside her on the edge of the bunk, after lights out, and did not leave for a long time. Finally, Marta said, "My husband was in a transport east." Hanna looked at her. "I don't know," Marta said. "If he made it." Neither of them spoke after that. They sat on the edge of the bunk in the dark, listening to the other women breathe, and outside the barracks a dog was barking somewhere near the gate, and the night was very cold, and Hanna understood, not for the first time, but with a new clarity, that she was not the only person in this room who was losing a city. The next morning, there were pancakes again. Hanna went to breakfast. She did not want to go. She went because going was what she did now, and because Mr. Harmon had told her, through the path behind the mess hall, "You eat the orange, understand," and because she had told herself, lying awake in the dark with the bombing of Bremen sitting on her chest, that she would eat whatever he put in front of her, for as long as he kept putting things in front of her, and she would not refuse anything. She sat in her usual place. Greta was across from her. Liesel was beside Greta. Marta was beside Hanna. She ate the bacon. She ate the eggs. She ate the pancakes. She was halfway through the coffee when Mr. Harmon appeared at the end of the table. He had the second coffee pot with him. He refilled each cup, 1, 2, 3, for her, slowly and with his attention on what he was doing. When he finished pouring Hanna's cup, he did not walk away. He set the pot down on the corner of the table. He looked at Hanna directly. "Bremen," he said. She stared at him. He had learned the name of her city. Someone had told him, Ellis, probably, or the translator. Someone had told him where she was from, and he had remembered it, and he had brought it to her table, and he was setting it down between them like a small object. She nodded. He did not smile. He did not offer condolences. He did not say the things that Americans said in Hanna's experience, when they did not know what else to say. He said, instead, one sentence. His voice was rough, and his English was slow, and his accent was not one Hanna had learned to parse yet. "I've got a son in Germany," he said. He waited to make sure she had understood. She had. She had understood every word. He picked up the coffee pot. He moved to the next table. He did not come back. Marta beside her, had heard. Greta, across from her, had heard. Liesel, beside Greta, was looking down at her plate, because Liesel could not look at moments like this one without something breaking in her face. Hanna finished her coffee. She did not remember, afterward, what it had tasted like. She thought about Mr. Harmon's sentence for the rest of that day, and the next day, and the day after that. "I've got a son in Germany." He had not said it as an accusation. He had not said it as a confession. He had said it as a fact, the simplest and smallest fact he could produce, to a woman whose city had been bombed, in a hall where that woman had just been eating the breakfast he had cooked for her. She understood, finally, on the fourth day, as she watched him pour coffee for a new prisoner at a far table, that he had not been feeding her. He had been cooking every morning the breakfast he would have made for his son, and serving it every morning for every transport to the women in the hall, because somebody, somewhere, might be cooking breakfast for his son the same way. That was the shape of it. It was not forgiveness. It was arithmetic. A man with a son in danger had done a quiet private sum, and the answer had been breakfast. We need to talk, for a moment, about what you just heard, because it is the kind of thing the textbooks leave out. Textbooks talk about policies. Textbooks talk about the Geneva Convention, about food rations, about the calories allocated per prisoner per day. Textbooks do not talk about men like Frank Harmon, who made a private decision in a camp in rural America to cook the breakfast he wanted his son to come home to. These stories are the reason this channel exists. If you want more of them, the hidden human pieces of this war that the history books didn't keep, subscribe now. You won't find them anywhere else. In the fourth week, Liesel collapsed. It happened in the morning, in the line outside the mess hall. She had been quiet for 2 days, quieter than usual, and Liesel was already the quietest of them. And when the line began to move forward, Liesel did not move with it. She stood still for a moment, holding her empty tray. Then her knees went. The tray hit the gravel. Liesel went with it. Greta caught her before her head touched the ground. Greta was older and smaller than Liesel, but Greta had the reflexes of a woman who had been catching people for a long time, and she was down beside Liesel in a moment, pulling her into her lap, and calling out in German for water, for a blanket, for someone to help. Sergeant Brennan was there in 4 seconds. He was always close to the mess hall during breakfast. He knelt down. He put a hand on Liesel's forehead. He said something to Private Ellis in a low voice, and Ellis ran for the medical tent. Liesel was taken to the infirmary. She did not wake up until the afternoon. The cause was simple. She had not been eating enough. She had been eating a little, the pancakes, the bread, but her stomach, after the long transport and the months before the transport, could not hold much at once, and she had been taking the small portions at breakfast and refusing supper, because supper was harder for her for reasons she could not explain to anyone, not even to Greta. The camp doctor, a tall, quiet American named Dr. Fisher, whose grandfather had come from Bavaria, told them, through the translator, that Liesel would be fine. She simply needed rest and regular meals. She would be allowed to eat small amounts throughout the day. He would make the arrangements with the kitchen. Hanna sat beside Liesel's cot in the infirmary that evening. She was not supposed to be there, but Dr. Fisher had looked the other way after she had told him, in the little English she had, that she had done this kind of sitting before. He had asked her one quiet question, "Field?" And she had nodded, and that had been enough. Liesel was asleep. Her face was very pale against the pillow, and Hanna, without thinking, reached for the wrist on top of the blanket and fell for the pulse the way her training had taught her, for years ago, in a hospital that no longer existed. The pulse was there, thin but steady. She let go of Liesel's wrist and folded her own hands in her lap. Mr. Harmon came in at around 7. He was not supposed to be in the infirmary either. He was carrying a small tin cup. Inside the cup was applesauce, warm, fresh, with a small piece of bread floating on the top. He set it down on the wooden stool beside Liesel's cot. "When she wakes," he said to Hanna, without looking at her, "you feed her this, spoon at a time. You understand?" Hanna nodded. He looked at her, then, briefly, just long enough for her to see something that was not quite pity and not quite anything else, but was shaped very faintly like recognition. "Good girl," he said. He left. Hanna sat with Liesel for another hour, until Liesel woke up, and Hanna fed her the applesauce 1 spoon at a time, as instructed. Liesel ate it. Liesel did not cry. She was too tired to cry. Hanna did, a little, when she thought Liesel was asleep again, but she kept spooning the applesauce until the cup was empty, and Liesel had eaten all of it. Pause the story for a second, because I want to ask you something specific. What do you think Liesel understood in that infirmary about what was happening to her? Not the doctor, not the cook. What did she understand? Tell me in the comments. I want to know what you see that I might not be seeing. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. You're deep enough in this story now that you already know why you should. Something began to shift in Hanna in the 5th week. It was not a dramatic shift. There was no single moment, no revelation, no scene where she looked up at the sky and decided something about herself. The shift was smaller than that. The shift was that she stopped, without deciding to stop, doing the thing she'd been doing every morning for a month without knowing she was doing it. She stopped waiting. At breakfast, she no longer sat with her hands folded and her eyes on her tray, waiting for the moment when the food would be taken away. She no longer checked the room for the guards. She no longer paused before eating to see if the other women were eating. She simply ate. When she sat down at the bench, she sat down. When the tray was in front of her, she picked up the fork. When the coffee came, she drank it. It was no longer a decision. It was no longer performance. It was no longer a small act of defiance against everything she had been told she could expect. It was breakfast. The day she first realized this had happened, she was halfway through her eggs when she noticed. She looked down at her plate. She looked up at the room. She looked at Marta, who was eating bacon with the calm of a woman who had decided, months ago, that the bacon was for her. She looked at Greta, who was praying quietly between bites. She looked at Liesel, now back from the infirmary, thinner still but upright, who was eating a biscuit with both hands. And she understood that she had crossed a line she had not known was there. Somewhere in the last weeks, without intending to, she had stopped being a person who was eating American food. She had become a person who ate breakfast. The difference was not small. The difference was everything. Marta had her own turning. Hanna saw it on a Tuesday in the 5th week. They were sitting at breakfast. As always, Mr. Harmon was pouring coffee at the far end of the hall. Marta picked up her orange, which she always ate at breakfast, quickly in 2 bites, like something she was stealing, and she did not eat it. She held it for a long moment. Then she put it in her pocket. She looked at Hanna across the table, and for the first time since Hanna had known her, Marta did not say anything at all. She just held Hanna's eyes for a moment, and looked down at her coffee, and drank it slowly. That evening, in the barracks, Hanna saw Marta place the orange on the shelf beside her own bunk. It was still there, uneaten, 3 days later. Hanna did not ask what Marta was saving it for. She understood, without being told, that it was not about the orange. It was a Thursday when the newcomers arrived. Thursday was laundry day. The American flag on the mess hall pole had just been raised. The mist had not yet lifted off the field behind the barracks. Hanna was walking back from the kitchen with a load of fresh towels. She had been assigned to kitchen help 3 weeks earlier at Mr. Harmon's quiet recommendation, and her days now include a half-hour of folding linens before breakfast. When she saw the trucks, there were 2 of them, army green, canvas covered. They came into the gate slowly, and they parked in front of the processing building, and the back flaps opened, and the women began to climb down. There were 18 of them, all young. The youngest could not have been more than 17. They were thin in the way Liesel had been thin when she arrived. They were quiet in the way Greta had been quiet when she arrived. They were looking at the camp the way Hanna had looked at it 5 weeks ago, not seeing the barracks, not seeing the watchtowers, not seeing the mess hall, but seeing, instead, an idea captivity that they had carried with them for weeks or months across an ocean, and try to fit that idea over reality in front of them, and failing. They were processed quickly. Paperwork, uniforms, Barack assignments. By the time Hanna came into the mess hall for breakfast, the newcomers were there, lined up at the serving counter, holding their trays. Sergeant Brennan was at the door, as always. He watched the newcomers. He watched Hanna. He did not speak to either. But as Hanna passed with her own tray, he did something he had not done in 5 weeks. He did not look away. He looked at her directly for exactly 1 second. His face did not change. But Hanna understood, as she had begun to understand many things in this camp without being told, that he had made a decision about her a long time ago, and he was letting her know that the decision had held. They stood the way Hanna had stood. She saw it from the doorway, the 6-step stop, the frozen hands, the eyes fixed on the tray, the way the orange on the corner of every tray looked. To them, impossible, not real, not theirs, not something that belonged in a prison camp. Marta, beside her in the doorway, gave a short breath. God, Marta said quietly, they look like we did. Hanna walked past them to get her tray. She sat down at her usual bench with Greta and Liesel and Marta. She ate her breakfast. She did not look over at the new women, because she did not want them to feel watched. But she saw the girl. The girl was the youngest one. 17, maybe. She had light hair pulled back in a short braid and a sharp, narrow face, and she was standing at the end of the line with her tray balanced awkwardly on the flat of her hands, as if she were not sure whether she was allowed to hold it closer to her chest. She had received her food from the counter 2 minutes earlier. She had walked the benches. She had stood at the end of an empty bench. She had not sat down. She had not eaten. She was simply standing there. She was crying, without making any sound at all. Her face was wet and her shoulders were shaking. And in between the shakes, she was trying to lift the tray up high enough to hide her face behind it, but she could not manage it, and she was very slowly coming apart in the middle of a mess hall of strangers. Hanna watched her for about 15 seconds. Then she stood up. Marta did not stop her. Greta did not say anything. Liesel, who had been halfway through her bread, looked up, and her eyes, Hanna would remember later, had a kind of hope in them that Hanna had not seen in any eyes in a long time. Hanna walked across the hall. She walked slowly. She did not want to spook the girl. She did not look at any of the American guards as she went, and none of the American guards looked at her. She walked through the noise of 100 women eating breakfast, through the smell of coffee and bacon and warm bread, through the long gray light coming down through the high windows, and she stopped beside the girl at the end of the empty bench. She did not speak, at first. She simply reached into her own pocket. She had her orange from that morning. She had not eaten it. She had been saving it, not because she could not eat it this time, but because she had been saving her orange almost every morning for weeks now, and she had a small collection of them on the shelf above her bunk, and she ate them 1 or 2 a day, and the system had become its own kind of ritual. She took the orange out of her pocket. The girl looked at her. The girl's face did not know what to do. The girl was looking at an older German woman, because Hanna, now, to a 17-year-old, was an older German woman, holding out an orange, and the girl had no framework for what to do with this. "Es ist für dich," Hanna said, quietly. "It is for you." The girl did not move. Hanna reached forward and placed the orange on the corner of the girl's tray. The tray already had an orange on it. The girl now had 2 oranges. She looked down at them. Hanna nodded once, very slightly. The nod came out of her before she thought about it. She did not recognize it in the moment as anything other than her own small gesture, a small movement of acknowledgement, the kind of thing you do when words are not the right shape. Only later, back in her bunk that night, would she understand where she had learned it. Only later would she remember a man in a white apron, standing at a counter across a mess hall on a cold first morning, nodding once at a table of women he did not yet know. She sat down on the bench next to the girl. She did not do anything else. She did not put her arm around the girl. She did not speak. She simply sat beside the girl, and she picked up her own tray, which she had brought across the hall with her, and she began to eat her breakfast beside the girl, as if they had been sitting together every morning for weeks. The girl stood for a moment longer. Then she sat down on the bench next to Hanna. She did not eat right away. Hanna did not look at her. They simply sat together, and Hanna ate her eggs, and the girl's shaking began to slow, 1 small breath at a time. After a long time, 3 minutes, maybe 4, the girl picked up her fork, and at the far end of the hall, beside the kitchen door, Mr. Harmon set his coffee pot down on the counter. He did not look at Hanna. He did not look at the girl. He stood for a moment with both hands on the edge of the counter, the way he had stood on Hannah's first morning, and his eyes went to the floor just in front of his boots. And then he turned around and went back into the kitchen. If something in you just moved, and I think it did, I want you to stay with me for these last few minutes. This is a part one wrote last and rewrote 4 times because it is the part one most wanted to get right. Subscribe if you have not. There are more of these. There are more Hannas, more Gretas, more Frank Harmons. They lived, all of them, in the cracks of a war the history books wrote too cleanly. This channel is the place they come back to. The girl's name was Ursula Klein. She was, as Hanna had guessed, 17 years old. She was from a small town in Saxony that had been swept over by the retreat in the final weeks, and she had no family left that she knew of, and the transport that had brought her across the ocean had been the longest 7 weeks of her life. She had not spoken in the processing building because she had forgotten how to make her voice work. She spoke a little over the next days. She ate. She slept. She was assigned to a bunk in Hanna's barracks because the barracks had a spare bed, and because Sergeant Brennan, who knew more than he pretended to know about which women had been paying attention to which other women, had decided, without telling anyone, that Ursula would do better near Hanna. In the second week of her time in camp, Ursula ate her first orange. Hanna watched her eat it, sitting on the edge of a bunk, and she saw the same expression that had been on her own face, on her own first orange, on her own bunk, weeks earlier. Something in Ursula, when she finished, looked less hollow, and Hanna, looking at her, understood something she had been moving toward for weeks but had not quite reached. The thing that had saved her had not been the food. The food had been the vehicle. The food had been the sentence. The food had carried the real thing. The real thing was that in a country at war with her own, in a camp surrounded by fences and watchtowers, a man had decided, without being asked to decide, without being ordered to decide, without being thanked for the decision, that the women in his hall would eat as if they had been expected, as if their coming had been prepared for, as if someone somewhere had known they were hungry and had begun making breakfast before they arrived. She ate because she had been expected. That was the shape of it. The orange, the butter, the path behind the kitchen, and the man with the limp, and the words in his quiet voice. You eat the orange, understand. Being expected did not erase the war. It did not bring Marta's husband home. It did not undo the years behind them or the uncertainty ahead. But being expected meant that the world had made room. A small room, long benches and a coffee pot, and a man in a white apron. But a room, and a room, in the middle of a war, was more than any of them had known was possible. The war ended. Of course it ended. Wars always end. The women in Hanna's camp were, in time, moved, processed, assessed, and eventually repatriated. Some went back to cities that had been destroyed. Some went back to towns they no longer recognized. Some stayed, in the end, in America, because the people they had been broken in the camps, and the people they became had been built in the kitchens. Mr. Harmon's son came home. Hanna learned this from Private Ellis, who wrote her a letter after the war, in an English that had improved considerably since she had last seen him. His son had been a prisoner in Germany for 16 months, and he had been treated, according to his own account, with a specific and limited decency that some camps had offered, and he had survived, and he had come home, and the first meal his father had cooked for him had been pancakes. Mr. Harmon himself died in 1961. Hanna read the obituary in a letter Ellis sent her from Kansas City. The obituary did not mention the camp. The obituary said he had been a baker. Hanna lived a long life. She married, in 1953, a quiet Dutch man named Joost, who had also been somewhere in the war and did not like to talk about it. And they had 2 children and a kitchen with a window that looked out over a canal. And every Christmas, she sliced 3 oranges into rounds and put them on a plate with cloves stuck into the peel, because that was what her mother had done, and because that was what she had done on her bunk in a wooden barracks in Missouri. Peeling an orange at lights out with the smell. Filling the room, she told her children about the war, a little as they grew older. Not the bad parts. The bad parts belonged to her. But she told them about Greta and about Marta and about Liesel, who had come back, in the end, and become a school teacher in Hamburg. She told them about Ursula, with whom she exchanged letters, until Ursula's death in 1987. She told them about the first morning in the mess hall about the tray, about the pancakes she had not eaten for the first 10 minutes. She always ended the story the same way. She ended with the orange. She told them how she had put in her pocket and walked back to the barracks and placed on the shelf. She told them how she had saved 6 more. She told them how she had eaten them. Eventually, one at a time, after a man with a limp had told her, in a path behind a kitchen, that the orange was for her, she told them how she had given one of them, one orange, to a girl named Ursula in a mess hall in the 5th week of her captivity, because Ursula had been crying and there was nothing else to give. She did not tell them the meaning of it. She never told them the meaning of it. She told them, instead, about the weight of the orange in her hand, and the smell of it when she peeled it, and the way the peel had come off in one long spiral, the way her mother had taught her, and her children, listening, understood, the way children always understand things their parents cannot say directly, that the orange had been important, that the orange had been the whole story. One last thing before you go. I want you to think about Hanna, years later, not on that first morning in the mess hall, but 30 years on, in a kitchen in the Netherlands at Christmas, with the smell of oranges filling the room, and her children at the table, and her husband in the next room, and the slow, quiet work of clothes being pushed into orange peel. Write me what you think she felt in that kitchen when she remembered one sentence. I read every one of them. And if you are not subscribed yet, this is the moment. The next story is already up. It begins with a German nurse who expected torture and found, instead, one medical exam that changed everything. The link is on your screen. Subscribe and click through. The next hour starts where this one just ended. The last morning of Hanna Brandt's life was a cold one. She was 83. She woke before dawn, out of a habit she had kept for most of her adult life. And she sat in her kitchen in the blue half-light, and her daughter, who was visiting that week, made coffee. Her daughter set the cup down in front of her. Hanna wrapped both hands around it. She did not drink immediately. She smelled it first, the way she had smelled every cup of coffee for the last 60 years, and her eyes closed, and the morning came back to her, the long mess hall, the white apron, the man with the limp, the orange on the corner of the tray. She did not cry. She had stopped crying about that morning a long time ago. She drank the coffee. She ate a small piece of bread. On the plate beside the bread, her daughter had placed half an orange, cut into segments, because that was what her daughter did on the morning she visited, because her daughter had known, since she was small, that her mother liked an orange in the morning. Hanna ate the orange. It was not quite the same as she remembered. It never was. But the weight of it in her hand for a moment was exactly the same as the weight of the orange in her pocket on the walk back from the mess hall, 5 decades and an ocean ago, in a wooden barracks in a country she had once been told would be the end of her. It wasn't that the food was allowed. It was that they were.